I would just add that it appears that the Iranians have shut down Fujairah. They're two important ports where oil is continuing to come out of the Middle East. One is Yanbu, which is the Saudi port on the Red Sea. And as you said, it looks like the Houthis may shut down the Red Sea. And that means that the Saudi oil going to Yanbu will not come out of the Red Sea. And I would just note quickly that even if the Houthis don't shut down the Bab al Mandab Strait, which is what closes off or potentially could close off the Red Sea, the Iranians could just attack Yanbu and shut down the flow of Saudi oil coming out of Yanbu. And as I said, they've already shut down the flow of oil coming out of Fujairah, and that's the United Arab Emirates port on the Sea of Oman that is outside of the Strait of Hormuz. So it's just very important to understand the UAE has been shipping probably about 1.7, 1.8 million barrels a day out of Fujairah. And that's now been cut off. And it looks like the Saudi oil flow out of the Red Sea is likely to be cut off as well. So I just wanted to emphasize that those two places, Fujairah and Yanbu, really do matter. And both are now involved in the mix in a serious way. Uh, I think to answer your question, Glenn, what's happening here is that the war is escalating uh, more horizontally than vertically. Uh, you remember we had this big air war from February 28th to about April 8th. And then the air war ended, and we transitioned on April 13th to the blockade. Well, these tit for tat attacks that are now taking place every day for probably about the past 8 days are not the same as the air war. They're not that extensive. And a lot of people are wondering whether we will vertically escalate and, in effect, go back to the air war that took place in the first 40 days of this conflict. That has not happened yet. But there is, and you described it very well, this horizontal escalation that is taking place. I don't think that Jordan had been hit before 2 days ago, but it's clear that the Americans are now, that the American base in Jordan is now being pounded. And of course, the Gulf states are being pounded. And it looks like, we see substantial horizontal escalation, especially when you throw in the whole Yanbu and Fujairah scenarios that I described when I began talking. So this one is escalating for sure.
Well, it's always difficult to make predictions, but a good place of well, point of departure would be to assess the strategies of each side. That is, what are the objectives they aim to achieve? What resources can they mobilize to achieve those objectives? How do you see the theory of what a victory might look like if you see it from the American perspective versus the Iranian? What is it that each side want to achieve here, and how can they actually achieve it?
Yeah, great question. Let's just start with the Americans. I don't believe that they have a theory of victory. I believe that President Trump is just flailing around. Um, if you go back to June 17th and the memorandum of understanding that was signed that day, that was basically a surrender document. It's quite clear that excuse me, that the Iranians won on almost every point. If you look at the 14 articles, it looks clear to me that the Iranians won and we, the United States, lost. Uh, so the question you then have to ask yourself is, given what's happened since that memorandum was signed on June 17th, what have we done militarily to change the situation? Where's our new coercive leverage coming from? I mean, we obviously didn't have much coercive leverage before the signing of the June 17th Memorandum of Understanding. Otherwise, we wouldn't have signed it because it was a surrender document. So you have to be able to make the argument that we now have some sort of military capability or economic capability to change the situation that existed on June 17th. And I see no evidence of that. If you look at what Trump has done, he's done two things. One, he's now reinstituted the blockade. And the blockade, the original blockade, went from April 13th until June 17th, when the Memorandum of Understanding was signed. That's a little over 2 months. It didn't work. That's why we signed the Memorandum of Understanding. It just didn't work. So why do we think it's going to work now? I have no idea what they're thinking. I can't see why it's going to work now when it didn't work in the past. The second thing that's happened is since last Tuesday, uh, this is July 7th, President Trump has gotten back into the tit for tat business with the Iranians. And since last Tuesday, July 7th, up till today, July 15th, the Iranians and the Americans are engaged in a tit for tat campaign. Well, if a serious strategic bombing campaign didn't work in the first 40 days, and we've played the tit for tat game before, we played it between June 26th and June 29th, and it didn't work. Why do we think it's going to work now? And if you look at what's actually happening in this tit for tat campaign, there's no evidence that we have the upper hand. The Iranians are pounding countries like Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, and so forth and so on. The Iranians have shut down Fujairah, as I said. So this tit for tat campaign does not appear to me, or hardly anybody I know, to be working. So the tit for tat campaign isn't working, and another blockade is not going to work. So, how do we get the coercive leverage to get a new memorandum of understanding where we do much better the next time than we did on June 17th? I don't see a plausible story there that can support the argument that we are going to win this time, whereas we did not last time.
Yeah, no, it's well, one gets the impression sometimes that there might not actually be a plan in place. That is, I saw, of course, yes, you did as well. Trump, he announced this 20% fee on all ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz, and then, I think it was only 24 hours later he had to start walking back, saying, "Ah, we're not going to put fees on ships. This, shouldn't be fees anywhere." It's just very hard to see. All of this essentially suggests that there might not actually be a strategy here, that they just going, day to day, which, if this is the case, it's quite concerning. But if you see it from the Iranian perspective, though, what is it that, I mean, is it only to make sure that the US bases get wiped out? They put the global economy at stake, given that the world would blame the US and Israel? Or how do you see what's the silver bullet here for the Iranians? Is it controlling the Strait of Hormuz, or how does Iran win? Or to some extent, perhaps it already did win.
Well, look, there's going to be some sort of agreement at some point in time, in all likelihood. I mean, I find it hard to believe that you're not going to get some sort of understanding. I mean, just think about the nuclear issue. The United States and the Israelis are desperate to get uh, a nuclear agreement. And you can't get a nuclear agreement unless you stop this fighting and you get a new memorandum of understanding. There's just no way around that. So there are just all these issues on the table, economic and political and military, that were encapsulated in the 14-point memorandum of understanding on June 17th. And the point is that somewhere down the road, you're going to get another memorandum of understanding or something that looks like that. Um, I don't know exactly where we're headed, but there has to be, in my opinion, some sort of agreement. This can't go on forever, certainly from an American point of view. Uh, so then the question is, how do the Iranians think about this? Now, on June 17th, when they signed the Memorandum of Understanding, there were a lot of people, usually referred to as the hardliners in Iran, who thought it was too early to cut a deal. You don't want to cut a deal now. You've got the United States over a barrel. You got them right where you want them. Let's just keep this war going. And the more time goes by, the better the deal we get. That's what the hardliners said. They also said, you really can't trust the Americans. You have to have the Americans in a desperate situation before you can really work out a deal. The hardliners, however, lost. And the middle of the roaders won. And you got the Memorandum of Understanding, which was signed by the Iranians. Well, I argued at the time, not publicly, but to a number of my friends who agreed with me that the hardliners were right. They should have waited. And the hardliners have now triumphed. And the Iranians are not just going to go back to the Memorandum of Understanding easily. They're going to drive a really hard bargain because they understand that the longer the war goes on, the better that is for Iran because the more bargaining leverage they have. The closer we get to the cliff economically, and the more desperate the Trump administration gets, the more likely it is that Iran will get a really good deal and that the Americans will be forced to stick to that deal. So I think what's happening inside Iran now is that the hardliners have won and they have no interest in going back to negotiations anytime soon. And furthermore, if they do go back to negotiations, whenever that is, they want to drive a really hard bargain. And the longer they wait, the more coercive leverage they have. So I think that actually what Trump is doing is he's playing right into the hands of the hardliners. And the longer that he continues to escalate, the more coercive leverage the Iranians have. And I think, to be honest, that Trump understands this. This is why I think he's saying that if this isn't settled by next week, what I'm going to do is attack bridges and power stations. That's what he said. Well, why is he talking about going after bridges and power stations next week? Because he knows that he cannot let this go on. And the other reason, just to add to the mix, the other reason he can't let this go on is the United States does not have sufficient munitions to wage a long war. Remember, we stopped the 40-day war on April 8th, in part because we were running out of munitions. And we don't want to go back to a full-scale air war because we don't have the munitions. So a tit for tat is a tolerable alternative strategy, but only for a while. Because after a long period of time, a tit for tat strategy eats up all that spare weaponry or remaining weaponry as well. So Trump has a vested interest in bringing this to an end. And that's why he's talking about going after bridges and going after power stations. But the problem there is we've talked about many times, as you go up the escalation ladder, the Iranians can do all sorts of things to you. You meaning the Americans, don't have escalation dominance here. And what's happening with regard to Fujairah and Yanbu and the Red Sea more generally is just evidence of that. The Iranians are basically saying, if we can't let Iranian oil into world oil markets, no oil will come out of the Middle East. We're going to shut down the flow of all oil. this would have disastrous consequences for the international economy.
Yeah, and yeah, as you said,
Well, I think if you're talking about the alliance structure and the American basing structure in the Persian Gulf itself, I think this is going to have huge consequences. There's no way that can be avoided. Uh, the question that you're raising is what happens outside of the Gulf. I think with regard to East Asia, the United States has already weakened its deterrent posture with regard to containing China. I think there's no doubt about that. As I've said on the show before, instead of pivoting to Asia, we've been pivoting away from Asia because we've moved a lot of precious assets, military assets, out of East Asia to the Middle East in recent months. So we've weakened our hand in East Asia. But the fact is, Glenn, the United States and the East Asian allies need each other, and they will continue to work together. I think there's no doubt that the South Koreans and the Japanese, among others, have real doubts about American judgment at this point in time. As you watch the Trump administration flail around, it's probably quite disconcerting if you're a Japanese or South Korean leader to think that you depend on the United States of America to provide a security umbrella for you, because that can't help but not be very reassuring. But again, the South Koreans, the Japanese, the other East Asian countries allied with the United States just don't have much choice but to work with America to contain China. And of course, from the United States' point of view, containing China is of great importance. So I think in the final analysis, uh, the effects of this defeat in the Gulf will only have limited effects on America's alliance structure in East Asia. Uh, with regard to Ukraine and Russia, and therefore the question of what America's commitment to Europe looks like, it's very hard to read that situation. It looked up until recently like Trump was trying to greatly reduce the American military footprint in Europe and shift the burden of dealing with Russia in Ukraine over to the Europeans. Uh, and that appears to have changed, though. If you look at what happened at the G7 meeting in France in mid June, and if you look at what happened at the NATO summit in Ankara in early July, it looks like, if anything, the Americans have enthusiastically, and here we're talking about President Trump, he has enthusiastically endorsed the European campaign to help Ukraine wage war against Russia. So it doesn't look like our commitment to Europe and to NATO is at the moment being diminished. But it's very hard to say how this will play itself out over time. In good part because Trump changes his view, every other day, and he can turn on the Europeans on a dime. So who knows exactly what will happen there? But for the time being, it looks like this disaster in the Gulf is not having negative effects on the NATO alliance.
well, just as follow up on
Well, I think what impacts Trump is the narrative. I think the argument is being made in the propaganda campaign in the West that not only is the drone war, which you described, working very well, but also the Russians are in deep trouble on the battlefield, in effect. The Ukrainians have turned the tide and, if not just stymied, have not just stymied the Russians, but beginning to push them back in particular places. So it's not just the drone war, it's also what's happening on the battlefield. And then I think the third dimension in the propaganda campaign is to make the argument that the Russian economy is hurting badly and Putin is becoming increasingly unpopular, and it's not clear that he can remain in office. So if we keep up the drone campaign and we continue to help Ukraine on the battlefield, that will in effect topple Putin at some point, do damage to the Russian economy, and in effect will knock the Russians out of the ranks of the great powers. You remember early in the war, in the first year of the war, 2022, the Americans occasionally talked openly about delivering a significant defeat to Russia and knocking it out of the ranks of the great powers. And you actually see that kind of rhetoric coming back. And I think the Americans are once again making the argument that sanctions provide a magic tool for damaging Russia. Not just drones, but sanctions as well. And as you know well, Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, two senators, had long been pushing a new sanctions bill against Russia. And it looks like that bill, although it's been watered down a bit, is likely to pass the Senate. And Trump has said that he likes the bill. And this is a bill that's designed to cripple the Russian economy. Just very important to understand that. We're back to aiming to cripple the Russian economy. And Trump endorses the bill. And you have to marry that to what's going on in this drone war. It's quite clear that the Europeans believe that they can help Ukraine win the drone war, the long range drone war, not the drone war on the battlefield so much. But they can give huge numbers of drones to the Ukrainians and help the Ukrainians build up their industrial capability to produce drones. And that will allow Ukraine to inflict serious damage on the Russian economy and on Russian military capabilities. That's the story they tell. So I think what's happening here is that the West, to include the United States, is ramping up the pressure on Russia because they think they're winning the war. Now, I want to be very clear. I think if you look at what's happening on the battlefield, and I think the battlefield is what really matters, I think the Russians are winning. They're rolling back the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian army is in desperate straits. The only thing that's really keeping it going is the presence of drones. I think there's no question about that on the battlefield. But it's not clear that the Russians won't ultimately overwhelm the Ukrainian forces because they're stretched so thin. So I think on the battlefield, which matters the most, the Russians are winning. But there's no question that we're back to sanctions. And we think that this drone campaign, this long range drone campaign, can have a significant effect on the Russian economy and on Putin's standing. Well, let me come at this from a slightly different angle than I usually approach the subject. Uh, I believe that one of the principal reasons that the Russians attacked Ukraine in February of 2022 is they believed, quite correctly, I think, that Ukraine was becoming a de facto member of NATO. Now, if you fast forward to the present, I think that what's happening here is, and you can hear it in the rhetoric from people in the West, that Ukraine has gone to great lengths to, in effect, become not only a de facto member of NATO, but a de facto member of the EU. And it's very important to understand that the EU has become a more militarized institution since the war started in February of 2022. So when Ukraine works overtime to become a de facto member of NATO and a de facto member of the EU, what that means is that you have an intermingling, a coming together of Ukrainian military capabilities, Ukrainian intelligence, and Western intelligence, and the ability to build weapons. I mean, Trump said that he was going to grant the Ukrainians a license to build Patriot missiles inside of Ukraine. Just think about what this means. This is just another way of saying Ukraine is becoming a de facto member of NATO, a de facto member of the EU. It's being integrated into the West militarily. And again, at the same time, what's happening here is we're going back to sanctions in a big way with this Blumenthal-Graham bill. And we have the drone campaign, the long-range drone campaign. So I think from Russia's point of view, it is very clear that the West is joined together with Ukraine, even if Ukraine is not a formal member of the EU or a formal member of NATO, and that it is the West, to include the United States now, and Ukraine, that is waging war against Russia. And I think if you listen to the Russians speak, they are in effect saying that is the case. They understand what's going on. You and I are not the only two people on the planet who have figured this out. So the question the Russians face is, what do they do about this? And that what they do about it is a function of two factors. Number one, how serious is the threat? How serious is the threat of new sanctions? How serious is the problem of a long-range drone campaign against the Sea of Azov, against the Black Sea, against Crimea, against Moscow, and so forth and so on? How serious is that threat? And then the question is, what are the targets that the Russians can hit in Europe to bring an end to this close coordination between the Europeans on one hand and the Ukrainians on the other hand? It's not obvious what the Russians can do to break the growing link between Ukraine and the West. And this, of course, segues into the whole Sergei Karaganov argument about what Russia should do in the face of this threat. But the point I'm making to you, Glenn, just to encapsulate my argument, is that Ukraine and the West are growing closer and closer together. The West is becoming more invested in the Ukraine war than it ever has been. And from the Russian point of view, it's quite clear that what the West and Ukraine together want to do is they want to defeat Russia. And the question is, how can Russia avoid that outcome?